You have questions?
Hey, Francis. When investigating the alleged separate entity, is there anything else to do than observing the mirage or whatever it appears as? Sometimes I might...
No, I would formulate it differently. Instead of investigate the separate entity, investigate what is the evidence that consciousness is limited, that it is dependent on the body. You see, what is it that makes us believe that that is true? Or is it just a belief without any validity to it, or does it have validity? If yes, what is the evidence? You see, so it's more precise, and it's more surgical. If we know really what we want to find out, because if we formulate the investigation by saying, for instance, what am I or who am I? You see, it's vague. You know, most people say, well, I'm a man, I'm a woman, you know, I'm this body, so what? You see? It's very evident for them. So then we have, it's more precise if we first talk about consciousness. If we define consciousness or awareness as the reality which is hearing these words right now, because it's obvious that that perception is real, therefore there must be a reality that does the perception, and the reality that does the perception, okay, that's we, because we say I perceive, right? And I call it awareness, I could call it ego, I could call it self, you know, our self, our real ego, our real identity, our real nature. I call it awareness, but all these words are the same. So now, this consciousness, which is hearing these words right now, this reality that is hearing these words, what is the evidence that it is limited, separate, dependent upon the body? You see? Let's take an example. That it is limited. Only you can tell whether your consciousness is limited or not. Right? Only you. You're the only one who knows your consciousness. And if you look at your experience, for instance, limited in time, meaning it was not always there. How do you know? Can you answer the question, when did consciousness begin?
No.
Right? But most of us believe that it has a beginning. Some people believe it begins at conception. Other people believe it begins sometimes between conception and birth. Some people believe it, and some people believe it had begun already before. But then, Was it in the mother egg, or was it in the man's spermatozoid, the consciousness? Or were there two consciousnesses that then collide and no, these are interesting questions, right? As a biologist, it makes sense, right? Because if you say that it is dependent upon a body, and that it is that life comes always with some form of consciousness, then you have this mysterious thing that you have two cells, each endowed with consciousness, and then there are two consciousnesses that merge into one. That's very interesting. How? So, and also if we go that route, then it would mean that, for instance, each cell in our body, or at least our white cells, who navigate in the bloodstream, they would have each a consciousness of their own, right? How does this consciousness of our white cell merge with all kinds of interesting questions so only to discover that we cannot answer this question based on phenomenal evidence. Why? Because in order to answer this question, for instance, does consciousness have a beginning? This question cannot be answered hypothetically. It has to be answered experientially. But then it would require an experiencer of this beginning of consciousness. Right? Before there was no consciousness, and then out of the heart of the magician, consciousness arises. But you must be a witness of this birth of consciousness. But that would require a consciousness that would be there before. So it's not possible. It's an impossibility to answer this question experientially. And in spite of that, we believe that to be true. Why? If there is no experiential validation of a belief, it's just a belief, it's not a fact. And 99.99% of mankind believes that it is true, and that it is a fact. Now, if it doesn't have a beginning, the question of its end is even more complicated. How do we know it ends? In order to know that it has ended, we should die, be the witness of the ending of our consciousness, and come back. Well, you're laughing, but that's true, right? And come back to say, yeah, it ended. But then I came back. That's the return of the horror movies. So we have to come to the. So that's what I call the investigation. You see, to ask all these weird questions, because they are not weird. They make sense. It's like children. They ask very good questions. And the parents often think they are stupid, but in fact the children, they make sense. One day, I remember I was 4 years old. I remember that because it was around Christmas, and it was shortly after the war, and good stuff was rare. But some friend of my dad had brought a box of chocolate, and they were something, so I still remember those chocolates. And I remember the year, because on the box there was the year, 1948. So I was 4. No, yeah, around 4. And I asked my dad, where the thoughts, where do they come from? And my dad said, from the mind. And I said, the mind, Where does it come from, the kids? My dad was cooked already. And he was an absolute atheist. I mean, the F word was more okay than the G word, if you see what I mean, at home. And that's where does the mind come from? She said, this thought a little bit, he said, from consciousness. I remember that, I remember the word from consciousness. And where does consciousness come? And then he was really pissed off. And he was pissed off because of the answer he was going to give. I don't know, God. And for me, he said it, Mom, he said it.
But it can't be just intellectual, if I just ask the question, when did it begin? No answers will come, right? Is it just asking?
It's not intellectual because...
a contemplation isn't an intellectual...
No.
It's more kind of...
What is intellectual are concepts.
Right.
But the experience of consciousness is not intellectual, it's experiential.
Right.
So if you ask yourself a question about consciousness, that's a question. But in order to find the answer or the absence thereof, you look at your experience of consciousness.
Which is right now.
Yeah, and therefore,
there is no
whatever answer you get is experiential, it's not intellectual.
But I can't go back to my time in the womb to investigate that.
That's not what I'm talking. I'm talking about now.
Yeah, now.
My
question was, what else can I do than observe?
But by observing consciousness, you can know, you can understand that it is impossible for you to have experienced your beginning as consciousness, because you would have needed to be there before your beginning. And in the same way, when we believe that consciousness is dependent upon the body, let's say, for instance, when we believe that consciousness is inside the body, it was required to make this statement, to see the body and to see consciousness inside it. In other words, it would require for consciousness to be some kind of an object. You can say the brain is in the body, or the liver is in the body, because when you open them, you see the brain and you see the liver. But consciousness is not visible. So you cannot say consciousness is in the body.
I agree, yeah.
You see? It's a... So that's the investigation. And it is important to understand what I've just said, that although it seems to be intellectual, because we ask questions, and these questions, we use words and thoughts to formulate them, it's experiential. Just as the physicist, when he sets up an experiment, or she sets up an experiment, they are asking questions that can be formulated, right? what is the acceleration of gravity at the surface of the Earth? That's a question. And then they conduct an experiment from the tower in Pisa, they drop something and they measure the acceleration. So the question is intellectual, but the experiment is not. It's physical. And it is the same here. The question is intellectual, but we should differentiate between the question and the experiment it leads to. You see, that's very important also, because that's an argument which is often used, saying, well, everything you say is intellectual. Let me to my guru, who is a bhakti guru. You see, because this thing about the truth is yoga of jnana, or that's bullshit because it's just intellectual. No, it's not. It's experiential. News for you, it's experiential. It's not intellectual. It's very important to understand.
My question was, what else can I do than observe, right? I didn't ask about being intellectual.
Well.
So isn't observing the experiment?
My answer
experience?
But what can a physicist do other than observe?
Right.
He observes the result. At some point, there is something that he sees. There is a hand that moves like the hand of a clock, and he says, "Okay, it's there," or something like that. It's always something he sees, or the click of a Geiger counter, but it's something he observes, always. So, welcome to science, right? Observation is key. But you can ask different questions, just as a physicist asks different questions, and as a result, he sets up different experiments. Here, there are several ways to ask questions from consciousness. One way is to ask questions that can be formulated through thoughts, but there are other forms of questions that are formulated differently. For instance, actions. If we change the way we act in a certain situation, if we act differently from the way we used to act in the past, when we believed to be separate and limited consciousness, if we try to act as if consciousness was universal, it's also a question that we ask, but it's not a verbal question. It's by changing our ways, we have changed something in the structure of the universe, and we are interested in seeing how different the response of the universe is going to be. And this different response we are going to get is going to give us a hint as to whether consciousness is universal or not. And the hint is harmony, serendipity, harmony inside, serendipity externally. So that's the two elements of response we get from the universe or from consciousness. So these experiments we are conducting are part of the investigation. You see, it's not just asking question verbally, but that is important because it's a good way to start. You see, because because when we hear the first time the possibility for consciousness to be universal, that goes against a lot of things we believe. So obviously then a lot of objections that come from this massive belief system we have accepted over the years, these objections we have to come to the surface. And we have to address them because they may be true. You know, they may be true, so we have to be open to that. Every time someone comes here and asks something and formulates an objection, for instance, I come from the point of view that it could be true. That's very important. And I go back to zero. I go back to the beginning. I come from the possibility for that to be true, and I see what the implications are if it were true. What should we observe if it were true?
Thank you, Francis.
I'm even a little reluctant to ask again because I'm sure I've asked you before, I've heard your answer before, but now since you addressed the objections, something tells me I would like once more your view on this. When you were answering Adrian's question, you were also referring to a possible end of consciousness, so that there would have to be a witness for that and for that ending, and that would be consciousness again.
In order to establish, to experientially establish a fact, we need an observer of the outcome of the experiment. That's the point.
Yes. And I was trying to think if there wasn't maybe a different explanation possible for the beginning or the end. And for this, I was referring back to my one time that I had anesthesia. That's the right word, right? Anesthesia. So I'm, from what you just said, to assume it would be maybe an option to see that consciousness is dependent upon the body. So I'm just trying to go through my experience again of that. And I know that you have often dismantled it, but maybe you could go through it with me again. So I remember that the doctor who gave me the anesthesia said something that I should count backwards or whatever, and then there's this like blackout, I would call it. And then waking up in the room after the operation. So is it not valid to say, for example, in the moment of this recognition of the waking up in the room, to say there was no witness of the waking up, but like a moment after the waking up, the recognition, oh, here I am.
Well, first, this no witness of the waking up assumes that there was no consciousness.
Can you say, what was the first word? Knowingness?
You say the witness of the waking up. You say there was no witness of the waking up.
Yes, kind of, not as I would recall it. I mean, there was a witnessing of the, oh, I'm here again.
Yeah, but in order to have this thought, you needed to be already here, right?
Yes, right. There was a moment, right.
Right. Okay. But the problem with this argument is that you make the statement that consciousness was not present and that it came back at some point, and later on, realized, oh, I am back. That's what you are saying, right?
Give me a second. It was not present that it was present.
You are making the assumption it was not there during anesthesia, then at some point it came back, and later on, it realized, oh, now I am back. Is that what you are saying? I just want to understand what you're saying.
Yes, and I'm trying to understand if that is what my
saying.
Experience was, what I want to say. Yes, I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, how do you know it wasn't there?
You mean during the operation?
How do you know consciousness was not present? Yes. You claim it was not present, then it came back, then later on it realized, and I am back. I was very precise in asking you, is that your statement?
No, right. I'm just...
Okay. Now that you are here, my question to you is, how do you know it wasn't there? In order to make the statement that it wasn't there, experientially, you should have been there to be the witness that you are not there. Otherwise, it's not experiential, it's just assumption.
It's true, it's an assumption, yes.
So you see, so it's very important you can have all kinds of assumptions, you know. There are little green men on the other side of the moon, right? Fine, but
what can account for this? For this assumption, because this assumption this was my conclusion, you know, of the whole experience. I see it's just an assumption, but still there's
wait a minute. The conclusion of an experience is based upon observation of facts.
Yeah.
Perhaps not for lawyers, but for physicists, certainly.
Well,
I was going to say no, only for German lawyers, but it wouldn't have helped.
That's international, yeah. Well, I can see that the period, so to speak, between the moment I felt this blackout in the moment of, oh, here I am, I can see that it was like an assumption, or looking back, people were telling me, oh, it's 2 hours. Well, the watch told me 2 hours have gone by later on. And so there's no memory, right? But the fact that there's no memory doesn't imply necessarily that there was no consciousness.
Right.
Right. I know that from other answers you gave, and that makes sense to me. Is the experience of consciousness of itself, without objects, necessarily without memory? I think no. It can be with a memory, even though there were no objects present.
The experience of consciousness,
Pure
pure consciousness.
consciousness of itself, yes. I would say you can remember it, even though at least it's possible.
But what is it that you remember?
Consciousness it's experiencing itself without any objects, like a night sky without the fireworks.
But when you have the experience of consciousness without objects, what kind of time do you experience there?
No time.
No time.
No time.
So, it's an experience that, of course, there are no objects, there is no time, only you is present. And it's real. That's fine with me.
Maybe it's a weird question, but
No, these are good questions. You're a good lawyer.
yeah. But in this case, I don't want to win any case.
I know.
You know what I mean?
No, I know. I know. I know. You want to be satisfied.
Yes. I just want to. So, logically, I have to, from my experience that, and I would say I have experienced the timelessness of consciousness, in that then when consciousness is with itself, actually it would have to have this experience always. But it's not necessarily so that no, I can't make any sense of this, really. I'm sorry. I think okay, maybe let me try just a different approach. So it's other people would tell me, oh, 2 hours have elapsed. You were 2 hours in anesthesia. Looking back, I can say I have no memory of this, but no memory as we no is not necessarily any proof that there was no consciousness. So I mean, yes, now I see, in those 2 hours, consciousness must have been with itself as it has always been with itself, even when there were objects. So there was not even a change in consciousness. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Yes, it's the timelessness that I was kind of tripping over.
You see also, as you wake up, you don't feel that you have become another. It's still you, right?
Absolutely.
And the fact that it is still you is not related to things that you perceive outside.
No.
No. For instance, you could say, okay, I was in this room before the surgery. I find myself again in the room, in the same room upon waking up, which is not the case usually, but and I recognize the same doctor. That explains to me why it's still me. No, that's not how it works.
Of course not.
Right. Now, if there was an absolute interruption of consciousness, the new consciousness that arises will be a different one, right? What would tie it to the past? Since the conscious experience is made of 2 elements, the consciousness element, if you will, plus the phenomenal element. So, you agreed that the phenomenal element was not that which was establishing the continuity of I.
Yes.
So then, if we make the claim that in addition, the subjective element, the consciousness element, is discontinuous, what is there to establish the continuity of I? It's a little tricky because we could say yes, but when I come back, I have access to the memories of my youth, I have access to the familiar feeling of the body, and then but let's assume that in fact God tricks you. And that as you wake up in a different body, you reincarnate in a different body. Then you have no way to know.
What do you mean? Then I have no way to know what?
Yeah.
No, he understood, I didn't.
You have no way to know that the past that is now present in your memory is your past. Really.
Oh. No, you're right. Okay, I wake up in a different body with different memories.
Yeah, but
So-
there will be your memory.
Yeah, of course. Then I would say,
So
oh,
then
that's
you
not-
will completely assume the new
Yeah.
identity, right?
Yeah, of course. And I wouldn't even wonder because I have access to that memory, right?
Right.
Why did you bring up that argument now? No, because
But it's an interesting argument, independently from why. Because I don't remember
no.
why. It's too late to ask this question. I don't remember. I'm old.
But it was in the whole thing of the continuity or discontinuity of I, right? So so that we cannot. I'm still.
What I mean is that if that were true, we cannot be certain of the continuity of I if, because the argument I was using, yes, people could, some could object that in fact this sense of I, that it is still me as I wake up, it's not that much related to external elements in the world, the same room where I was before anesthesia, as a doctor I knew, etc. But rather, all the memories of my childhood that came back, that are available, the kind of job I have, and familiar sensations in my body that I remember. I say, okay, I check myself. Yes, that's me, right? But what I was saying is that if God just were a trickster, right, and would just surreptitiously after the anesthesia place you in the body of the guy next room, right? There is no way for you to know.
No, sure.
Now, how do you know God is not doing that constantly?
And simultaneously.
And simultaneously. What? Give her the mic, because...
Well, what is the you that's being placed in another body if it's all one consciousness? That doesn't make any sense.
But yes, but the you is his consciousness, obviously. The you is the consciousness. But we were in the dealing with the hypothesis of one consciousness, one body. You see, that's of course it makes sense in the case of one consciousness. But in the case of one consciousness, one body, I'm showing that there is no way to know. There would be a way to know if there is a continuity of consciousness, because then I've kept this continuity, so that's still me. You see? It is how, because we have always been the same. For us, consciousness knows its continuity throughout time.
That's so clear for me. I mean, it's so obvious, and that it has nothing to do with
memories, for instance.
And with the perceived side. It is so clear that the perceiving side establishes this continuity. But the only thing that I was stuck with is kind of this seemingly abrupt ending and then beginning.
Yeah, because the ending and the beginning is in that which is perceived. And it's not different from what happens when you go into deep sleep.
I know.
You don't remember any more deep sleep than you remember anesthesia. It's just that there is this dream period between that acts as the anteroom of the eternity of deep sleep. Did you like the movie, by the way? Yes. Yeah. It was not very successful. Did you like it?
Very much, actually.
Yeah?
Yeah. It is, I think for some it can be an acquired taste.
Yeah.
Because it's slower. If you connect with it. Oh, yeah, no worries. I'll give it to you.
We are talking for a friend online on a movie that we watched last night called Dean Spanley. It would be an interesting novel. As a novel, it's a short story, I guess, or long, and it's interesting, very British, very.
Yeah. But quirky.
I mean, the aesthetics of it is interesting.
I want to come back to the experience of consciousness knowing itself without objects. I might be fooling myself, and then it's also good to have this in the open. But I would say I remember this. consciousness knowing itself without objects.
But what you remember, since there are no objects, you only remember consciousness.
Yes, and I remember the understanding that there were no objects, that there was only me.
Yeah, of course, because you are still there.
Exactly.
As you remember. So we should have, when we use the word remember, we should have two words regarding that which we remember. We can use the word a memory or a recollection, and use the word remembrance that would apply to consciousness. Now, remembrance is very different from a memory for the following reason. That when we have a memory of a past event, that which we remember, this memory, is very different from the event itself as we experienced it. It's just a recollection. It's not the event.
No.
Right? Differently from the remembrance of consciousness, because it is the same consciousness, which is a non-event, that we remember. You see? So when we have the remembrance of consciousness, we go to the real experience of consciousness, unlike that which happens in the case of a recollection of a phenomenal event. We don't experience the same event, we just experience a recording of it in our mind that plays itself in time. So that's very important to understand, that the remembrance of consciousness is the experience of consciousness.
Yes, it makes absolute sense, also because it's always available. It leads.
Yes.
The real thing is available.
But it's experiential. In order to make a distinction between remembrance and memory. I mean, you can. That's my use of the word. Okay. I am. In order to avoid the confusion, I use two different words.
But what does that word mean? Remembrance.
Who cares? Let's call it XYZ. You know, who named that? Let's not argue about semantics.
No, it's not semantics, because it sounds like memory, remembrance. So what is I'm trying to understand what you mean, that's all. I'm not objecting.
I am addressing his question.
I know that.
Yeah.
Okay, explain.
I have. Your problem is not my problem in this case, because I'm having enough problem with my problem, but that's not my problem. So it's not that I get stuck with the word remembrance, because I know it's a non-event. My question is more, every night when we experience deep sleep, I mean, we are with ourselves. Consciousness is with itself. Why is the deep sleep not nirvikal samadhi?
Because you are assuming that there are no phenomenal perceptions in deep sleep. In other words, you are assuming that there is no mind activity in deep sleep, which is not the case. There is a lot of evidence by taking the electroencephalogram that there is mind activity both in deep sleep and during anesthesia. You are not flat lining during anesthesia in most cases.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
I think I finally got my question down to what I really want to ask. What prevents consciousness from experiencing itself without objects earlier on or all of the time? What is it that makes us, or at least believe, that we don't have this experience of consciousness without objects?
It's a choice of consciousness.
Not to see itself without objects clearly.
Yeah. To keep ignorance. Now otherwise we would fall asleep and ignorant and wake up a sage on the next morning, and that would be it. If we take only a one-night stand.
Which could happen as a...
Yeah, but even in France, that's why it's so important to make a distinction between what in India they call Turiya, the fourth state, and deep sleep. Deep sleep is a state, just as like waking and dreaming. And there is still some form of minimal mind activity, but there is still mind. In India, they use the Aum, A is, the A is for the waking state, the U is for the dream state, and the Bindu, the is for the, yes, that's a Bindu, right? The is for the deep sleep state. But the background of all three states, they call it the fourth state, is a pure consciousness state, the Turiya. It's a pure consciousness state. And this pure consciousness state is also present between perceptions during any of the other state. In other words, it's not like we are constantly in the waking state. We move between, when we understand something, we go out to the understanding, to the background of intelligence, and then we come back into the state, the perception. So, I would say if I use a metaphor, the mind, the body-mind, is like a house. And we as consciousness, we have many houses that we visit. And ignorance is like let's say a pair of sandals or a pair of slippers that we have in several houses. And as soon as we enter the houses, it feels so comfortable to go into those slippers. And then magically, we forget the rest. And there is at some point a first understanding of the nature of the slippers, the magic slippers, if you will. And when we come back to the house, we don't put them right away. But then, out of habit, we put them and we are miserable again. But there is a moment we enter the house and we leave the slipper in the closet, or even we trash them But there is this thing, there is something in the body-mind before we have the first understanding of the nature of the sleepers, if you will, immediately as we come back, we just go into it. It's a residue of ignorance. So in the Indian tradition, they have another metaphor. They say ignorance is like a bird. And when we go to sleep, the bird, inflates its feathers and puts the head inside, and sleep. But in the morning, when the sun rises, whoops, the head comes out, and then it flaps the wings. And so that's a description of ignorance. So there is some residual ignorance that remains, but of course it's stored in the body mind. It's a habit to put these slippers. A game we play that we love to play. And I have no valid explanation, because that was the only valid explanation in the first answer I gave. Because we want it, because we like it. If at any moment we don't like it any longer, we don't do it. That's that simple. It's always ignorance, it's a choice of consciousness. Consciousness is inherently free. Nothing external can impose anything to the reality, right? So everything that happens is a choice of this reality, including ignorance. And the mistake in ignorance is to believe that there is a separate person, and that's why when I say that we choose ignorance, often it triggers a kind of revolt, because they believe that we choose it as a person, whereas ignorance has already been chosen if we believe to be a person. And then they say, as a person, no, that's not true, I don't choose ignorance. Of course, as a person you don't. But as consciousness, you choose to believe to be a person. So you are already cooked. It's already too late. But in fact, it's never too late, because you can at every moment divorce ignorance. In fact, you were never married.
What did you say?
In fact, you weren't you were never married to it. You simply believed you were.
Yeah. Thank you.
John? Remembrance, ouch. He remembers still.
No, that's not my question. You said that in order to see for ourselves if consciousness is universal, that we do these experiments that you suggested, and if we find that internally there's more harmony and externally there's serendipity, that would go some way to suggesting that consciousness is universal. So my question is, why is that? Why would harmony and serendipity convince me that consciousness were universal?
Because the impact in the world is not the result of what you do, but is simply the result of the intention. In other words, two people can do the same thing. One with an impersonal intent and the other with an ignorant intent, in which case, in the case of the impersonal intent, there will be a serendipitous outcome. In the case of the ignorant intent, there will be not too serendipitous outcome. So, because it is not based upon what is done, but about the intent, and the intent, of course, comes from consciousness, then it shows that the universe, the connection between consciousness and the universe, and it shows also that consciousness rules the universe. You see? So that's why. And
So
in addition to that, the inner harmony that results, and the happiness, the peace that results, puts an end to the quest. You see, gives us satisfaction. In other words, we feel, yeah, now I have got what I wanted. You see, there is a sense of completion on all levels. You know, on the love we sought, the beauty we sought, the understanding we sought. You know, and at the end, we cannot formulate, but it's there everywhere. You know, the intelligence is there everywhere, the beauty is there everywhere, and the love is there everywhere. So there is a satisfaction which is so multidimensional. And because it involves the universe as one of the instruments, then the conclusion is that consciousness is universal, or that consciousness rules the universe, if you will.
I see, thank you.
Kathleen?
Okay. I have two questions. The first one's more straightforward. I really liked this experiment, or whatever you were saying about waking up in another body. And it got me thinking, like, that was from the perspective of one consciousness, one body. But the truth is that if we all went to sleep tonight and woke up in the person next to us' body, we wouldn't skip a beat. It would just...
We are everybody.
Right. And it could also be true that that's more the reality, because consciousness is so fluid. Like, it's,
Yeah, we are everybody, exactly.
there's no limit.
But the beauty is, because we are everybody, we never die. You see, it's called freedom.
I was noticing in all the proofs of the discussion that it didn't, we maybe could prove that we can't say for sure that consciousness was not there during anesthesia, but we also can't say with certainty that consciousness was there. It doesn't, it's a one-sided, seems to me like it was a one-sided proof.
But we know that consciousness is here and now.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the absence of consciousness is an interesting hypothesis which can never be tested.
Mm-hmm. Right, because you can't observe it. It's absent.
Which can never be experienced.
Right.
But consciousness is an experience. So the absence of consciousness has to be also an experience.
But it seems impossible. That seems impossible.
But what is an experience that can never be experienced?
Mm-hmm. Is that sufficient? Is that sufficient proof?
No. I mean, that's.
You're introducing uncertainty.
It's food for thought.
Yeah.
But it boils down to try to think, for instance, to ask yourself the question, what is the reality of consciousness experientially? In other words, if I am consciousness, the reality of consciousness is the reality of me. If I am consciousness, the reality of... Okay. But the reality of me is the real me. Try to find what's the difference between the reality of me and the real me. Mm-hmm. So the reality of consciousness is consciousness itself. Especially because I define consciousness as a reality, which is hearing these words, which makes sense because we are interested in our real identity, in the real me. And that's which differentiates the consciousness from the mind, for instance. Consciousness is obviously the reality of mind perceptions. In the realm of mind, right? The consciousness is that which is the background of all mind perceptions. And we know consciousness to be real because we cannot pretend that it's non-existent. You see? And so it has reality. But then when you try to see whether there is a daylight between a distinction between consciousness and its reality, what distinction is there?
Right, it's one.
You see?
Another question that popped for me was, what are we doing with our minds here? Are we trying to get our minds to step out of the way? Are we trying to convince our minds that your real place is? I mean, I guess we answer questions and
we are kind of what we are doing. We are using a reason to uproot unreasonable belief systems that we have adopted. Mm-hmm. And by unreasonable, I mean that are not substantiated by facts and or that are not the logical outcome of substantiated facts. Because reason is more than logic. Reason is the use of logic starting from facts, not from assumptions, mm-hmm. Right? So that's reason. Reason is more than logic, but it uses logic, but it starts from facts. That's how we proceed in daily life, hopefully, and in science. We are the use of reason. And so we use reason to uproot pseudo-reason by discovering that belief systems that were built, often using logic, sometimes using false logic, have been built upon primary assumptions that were not factual. Mm-hmm. So it's a deconstruction, if you will, but not in the sense of this new philosophers of Derrida and company. No, not in this sense. In a more radical sense, more in a Socratic sense, or mm-hmm. in a Cartesian sense, or in a Spinozian sense.
And then, how does that? Is it that
it liberates the mind from all kinds of
mm-hmm. False,
and it simplifies the question, all the questions we have, because at the end they boil down to a very simple one, which is the one I always ask: is consciousness limited or universal? No, it's not to be or not to be, it's to be limited or to be universal, right? That's the question.
Thank you.
A follow-up to John's question. What do you make, Francis, of the harmony? I don't know if you'd call it harmony, but certainly synchronicity in the game of ignorance, when the intention is not for the truth.
I mean, synchronicity is one of the aspects of serendipity. serendipity is a form of miracle. A serendipitous event or synchronicity also is a miracle, the denial of which is plausible, if you will. You see, it's a miracle, but most people would say, oh no, that's just a coincidence, or that's just... So there is a plausible denial. So it's the set of serendipitous events is a subset of the set of miracles. Because there is another subset, the complement of that subset is miracles that are for all to see and that cannot be denied. Not too many of those nowadays.
It seems as if there's a way that can be hacked in a way by ignorance. When you see like solipsistic, or when we call these they're not laws. I mean, when people act in certain ways and actually create serendipitous events that in fact were not intended for, were not based upon a desire for the truth. Like the game of ignorance, somehow we see serendipity. I'm just curious about that mechanism. It can be very confusing.
Give me an example.
Okay, so I'll just speak relatively. I'll just speak relatively about people. I've seen people compartmentalize the facts, like repress certain things, and then create a kind of reality. It's a way that ignorance works that creates a seeming reality and avoids the actual facts of a situation and creates a kind of synchronicity, like manipulates. It's a kind of a
Give me an example. I mean, you're giving me words. Right. So give me an example. A real example.
I might have to think about it. It's the way I've seen the solipsistic view work.
No, but,
right.
Give me an example, so that we know what we are talking about.
Okay, I'll think of one.
The earth is flat.
What?
All those who are going to say, oh, it's something else, are just complotists.
Yes, the earth is flat. Good luck with that.
Let's see if I can get this question together here. So we talked about, and I've had that experience of, anesthesia or being knocked out, and or last night, sleeping. So sitting here, talking with you, what is perceiving here?
Consciousness is perceiving.
But if that can be shut off by a hit to the head. So it's kind of like my personal consciousness, which is not
well. You're making the assumption that the reality that perceives can be shut off by a bullet in the head. What's the evidence?
I've been knocked out. I was there and I'm not there and then I'm back, like Krishna was saying.
Yeah, but we go back to the conversation we had. Your claim is that let's not take a bullet in the head, let's take the anesthesia. And some chemical in your system. You are making the claim that consciousness is shut off. What is shut off or changed is the content of consciousness, the thoughts, the perceptions. But what I call consciousness is not the content of consciousness, but it is the reality that perceives this content.
So that's the difference now in talking with you, is the reality that is perceiving?
I call consciousness the reality that perceives.
So you would say that is what is the conversation.
That's
right now.
what I call consciousness, because what you tend to call consciousness is what we could call mind. So then I agree. It could be said that mind gets altered, the mind states get altered by drugs. And definitely and irreversibly altered by a bullet in the head. So yes, I agree with that. Mind gets altered. There are altered mind states. But mind is not the reality that perceives the mind. I call consciousness the reality that perceives. Through the mind, through the body-mind. The body-mind is an instrument through which the universe, in fact, perceives itself. It's a self-aware universe, if you will. You know, if there is awareness of the universe in the universe, it means the universe is self-aware. That's another way to put it.
That's a large scope for me, just sitting here. So the question, is
I am
what
trying
is perceiving?
you see, I'm trying to discriminate between the reality which is aware and the instrument, the body-mind, through which this reality perceives. Even if we make the case that the body-mind perceives, the body-mind is not a reality unto itself. The body-mind and the universe share the same reality, and if we say that the body-mind perceives, we have to amend this statement by saying, in fact, it is the reality of the body-mind that really perceives. You see, that does the perceiving. And the body-mind is an instrument of this reality. So the body-mind doesn't exist in and by itself as a separate entity. That's why it's so important to ask ourselves, what is my reality? Not just what am I, but what is my reality? And what is my reality experientially? You see? For instance, if we look at it from the vantage point of science, we couldn't say that the body-mind is its own reality. The body-mind is made of quarks and gluons and a few other elements of the soup. And and everything around it is made of the same building blocks. So, and these building blocks, they are in total connection with each other, with each other. So it's you cannot isolate the body-mind. The universe is a totally integrated system. So even if we claim that this brain creates the thoughts, and even if we claim that this brain creates what the perceptions, the realities that create the perception has to be the realities that create the brain, that creates the body, that creates the universe. So the reality that perceives, that creates the perceptions, has to be universal, even from this vantage point, which is a materialist vantage point. Even from this vantage point. The moment we agree, and I cannot tell you how you reach this agreement, but the moment we agree that there is only one reality, then our reality is this one reality, you know, and that's our real identity, that's our real self. We are not separate. That's a great discovery. And the way we experience this reality is within, as human beings, because this reality is in the heart of all men and sentient beings as consciousness. So that's consciousness is the centrality of our human experience. It is our real self, and it is the self of the universe. And of all the universes that can be there, all the dimensions that can be there, it's an extraordinary creation. But already, if you think of this universe, it's something. If you think how small we are, this Earth, in this solar system, in this galaxy, and there are zillions of galaxies.
In a way, it's kind of relaxing, just kind of like, so infinite.
And then there might be zillions of universes. And if you go in that which is extremely small, there are other worlds there. It's God's majesty.
It's not what?
God's majesty.
I had a sort of epiphany when I realized that we are body minds with we are consciousness with body minds versus the other way around. And I came to your 2-hour weekend session, and I got your book, and I read it, and all the words made sense, and I had this experience of everything having this glow. I was just sitting in my backyard, and it was really a extraordinary experience, and it was so simple, it was just there. And it makes me wonder, when you talk about beauty and love and infinity, are we limited by our body minds to know beauty through music, art? Are those the primary vehicles by which we can experience beauty and truth?
There are vehicles, also nature. But then there is also the inner beauty, people, the inner beauty of people, the innocence, the childlikeness, the humor, the lightness, the love, the empathy, the compassion. People are beautiful, when they become interested in their true nature, then the beauty of the true nature shines through them. So, besides art, there are people, love, and there is also truth and humor. This adventure on earth is just a kind of an exploration. Out of the royal palace, like the king who said, okay, I want to experience being a beggar. And then he tells the guards, I'm leaving the palace dressed as a beggar. Don't let me back in for one day. Otherwise, I have your heads chopped off. So he goes out in the streets, finds it very uncomfortable. After 3 hours, he's back at the palace. And the guards tell him, sorry, sir, who are you? Do we know you? Then he says, I'm your king and you know that very well. And if you then don't let me in 21 hours, I have your head chopped off to let him in. So basically, if you remember being the king, the gates will be open, no matter what.
Francis, I wanted to clarify something. When we say that there is only one reality, you've said that from the materialistic standpoint, the reality of consciousness is the reality that perceives. And to me that makes sense, because I say the inquiry always starts with consciousness. The whole argument always starts with consciousness if I'm reasoning with a materialist. So ultimately the only thing I can be certain of is the reality of the instrument by which I make all my arguments. So I just wanted to check with you if this would be valid.
No, it's true that if consciousness is not real, we cannot have access to anything real. So whether we know it or not, all philosophers implicitly posit the reality of consciousness. Otherwise, they cannot say anything for real, right? Because whatever they perceive, whatever they consider to be facts, their certainty is always relative to the certainty of the consciousness that perceives them. So any philosophical system implicitly posits the reality of consciousness, but then they forget it and they pretend it's not.
Seem to forget it for a long time.
Yeah. But there is something good about it because for them they don't like beliefs, not substantiated by facts. So the God belief as a God, external God, all that is kind of repellent to them. And because they want to be experiential, if you will. So there is something good. And also, they don't like the common assumption that consciousness is tied to the body-mind, because then, if we live under this assumption, then the view of the world becomes very anthropocentric, centrist, right? So in order to reestablish the universality of this view, we have to be open to the universality of consciousness. And before that, to a universal reality. So that the reality of consciousness then is universal. That's all. It's very simple. One reality, Advaita, one reality, that's all.
Right. I find when I just to kind of hone on the question, when I'm discussing with being in academia, when I discuss with a materialist, they do seem to go to be open to the universality of reality, but they stop one step short. That this universal reality is not the perceiving reality. And I guess what I was clarifying.
But then there are self-contact. There is there is then an inconsistency in their reasoning, because usually a materialist would claim that consciousness is an emergent property of the body, right, of the brain or of the body. And then you have to take them as their words and say, okay. But at the same time, so it means that the reality of consciousness is the reality of the body. The body is part of the universe, so the reality of consciousness is the reality of the universe. And at that moment, we have moved out of the jail of the body-mind, you see? So it's just that they are not perfect materialists. They are materialists in name only. They are minnows. They are minnows. Materialists in name only.
Thank you.
Okay, time for the second question. So within this tiny earth here, there's many beings and all of them are aware, but it appears that humans are the only ones that are self-aware. Would you agree with that?
It depends on what you mean by self-aware. If self-aware means that they are aware of their consciousness, almost everybody is self-aware. You know, because most people, if you ask them in their consciousness, they would say yes, and if you ask them, how do you know that? They would say, I know that from my direct experience. So they wouldn't challenge that they are aware of consciousness. So most people are self-aware. But then most people believe that this consciousness is limited. You see, that the reality that perceives is dependent on the body.
Right, I agree with you. And so is that limiting belief or the ignorance, is it necessary in order to become truly self-aware of what we really are? Is that what kind of provokes us to look for the truth?
Yeah, because as long as, although we know that we are aware, but we believe this awareness is limited in scope and in time, that generates misery. Misery is a good thing, because misery is the incentive to look for the truth. So from the vantage point of the teacher, misery is the bad cop, the teacher is a good cop, they belong to the same police force. You see? So there is nothing wrong with misery. It's a good thing. Misery is a stick, the teacher is a carrot. They work together. The donkey goes back home. But misery, yes, because we have this deep knowledge of our immortality as consciousness. And so this belief that we were born and that we die, there is a conflict between this deepest belief and this belief we have adopted. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeking anything. Death wouldn't be a problem. But as human beings, unlike animals, we conceptualize ourselves.
Right.
You see? And with this ability to have the I concept comes also the ability to identify with another of this I with the body-mind. So we are blessed and cursed at the same time by this ability to conceptualize. So in ignorance we are worse off than the animal,
Right.
and in wisdom we are better off.
It's just so interesting that we're the only animals that, it seems, we're the only animals that have that experience. And it's just interesting, so yeah, thank you.
The French philosopher Pascal says man is somewhere in between the angel and the beast. And he adds, and whoever tries to qui veut faire l'ange fait la bête. Whoever tries to be an angel becomes a beast. So the Pope has to be careful.
I just have a few questions. So, in deep sleep, the reason why we find it so satisfying is because we experience ourselves, our timeless selves, which is what we want to experience all
Also
the time.
because a rested body is more rewarding as an experience. There is less of a sense of lack in a body which is well rested, and a mind which is rested also, than in a body which is tired and has not eliminated all the toxins and all of that stuff. So I know that Ramana Maharshi says, yes, we have the perfume of deep sleep which is still present. That's true. But there is also a more physical aspect to it in a rested body, a body which is well balanced, in terms of rest and nutrients and which has no needs, then the body becomes more transparent, and so we.
But if we're experiencing our true nature while we're awake, does that not have positive implications on the body anyhow?
We experience our true nature every time we experience happiness.
Which is timelessness. The experience of timelessness.
Yes, happiness is in a timeless place, because happiness is consciousness. So happiness is as timeless as consciousness.
But this is what we're after, this sense of timelessness, our true nature.
Yeah, it's a game of, like the Boy Scouts, finding the treasure.
But do we want to, is it, does this analogy work where we We want to be able to go to the movie and zoom into ignorance and be able to zoom out knowingly and zoom back in for a little while.
Yeah, if we
like
know,
that?
as long as we know we are at the movies, we enjoy the movies.
Right. What's the point without enjoying it?
Hmm?
What's the point without being able to enjoy it or enjoy
Yeah.
life?
Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering if that's a useful analogy. Is that what we're trying? Is that what we're going after?
You know, I took my son to see the Gremlins. He was like, I don't know, 6 or 7. But, he's the one who wanted to see the movie. So for those who have not seen the movies, these are very cute animals. And then at some point, if you feed them after midnight, they turn into monsters. And in the movie, it happens very suddenly. I don't know whether the reason I remember that in the movie, but because he was next to me. As soon as this has happened, whoop, he jumped on my he jumped on my lap. And it was Jan, my second son. But then he was on my lap, then he was watching the movie. I said, do you want to go out? You know? I said, no. So that's the situation of ignorance. It's really frightening. We are miserable, but we don't want to leave the theater. Then, the situation of wisdom is, I mean, we know it's a movie, but it's fun to believe it a little bit, and we laugh. You know, so that's...
I was also thinking as we were sitting here, if, God forbid, if for any reason all 7 billion people drop dead tomorrow, it would be absurd to think that consciousness would end. The thing that powers the universe, the plants, the birds, everything.
As I said, this planet and this solar system and even this galaxy is just a speck of dust in a huge desert full of dunes.
Yeah. Thank you.
How are we going? Okay, for our friends online, I'm going to take... Oh, my battery is going down the drain. Okay. So perhaps I'm going to take only this question, unfortunately. No, not even this question.